There is a building in Chicago that was constructed in 6 months. It covered 74 acres. It contained 14 million square feet of floor space. It had its own internal railway system, its own power grid, its own water supply, and its own postal service. It was built from the ground up in a city that, 40 years earlier, had been a trading post with fewer than 5,000 residents. When it opened in May of 1893, it attracted 27 million visitors over 6 months, nearly half the entire population of the United States at the time. When the fair ended, they burned it down. Not all of it. Some structures survived, repurposed, rebranded, but the core of what they called the White City, the central complex of buildings that had stopped the breath of every person who walked through its gates, was systematically demolished. Officials cited maintenance costs, liability concerns, the impracticality of permanent exhibition spaces. The explanations were reasonable. The speed of the demolition matched the speed of the construction, which is to say, it was impossible. I've stood on the site of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition. I've walked the ground where the Palace of Fine Arts still stands, the only major structure permitted to survive intact, and looked at its proportions, its columns, its architectural language, and felt the familiar dissonance I've come to associate with 19th century buildings that shouldn't exist. The scale is wrong for the official story. The detail is wrong for the timeline. And the more you understand about what the World's Fairs actually were, the harder it becomes to believe the construction narrative we've been given. I'm not the first person to notice this, but I want to take the observation seriously, follow it where it leads, and document what it actually means if the conclusion is correct. Because the conclusion, once you sit with the evidence long enough, is extraordinary. The World's Fairs were not built, they were revealed. The Crystal Palace of 1851 was the beginning, or rather, it was the beginning of what we were told. The Great Exhibition in Hyde Park, London, was presented to the Victorian public as a triumph of modern engineering, a vast glass and iron structure erected in 9 months to house the industrial achievements of the British Empire. 92,000 square feet of exhibition space. A structure so large it enclosed full-grown elm trees rather than cut them down to clear the site. 9 months. I have spoken to construction engineers about what it would take to replicate the Crystal Palace today. With modern equipment, modern materials, modern labour practices. The consensus is consistent. With 21st century construction technology, 9 months would be aggressive. With mid-Victorian hand tools, horse-drawn transport, and a workforce that had never built anything remotely comparable in scale or material composition, 9 months is not a construction timeline. It is an impossibility, dressed in the language of achievement. But here is what makes the Crystal Palace genuinely extraordinary, and what the official history glosses over with uncomfortable speed. When the Great Exhibition ended in October 1851, the Crystal Palace was disassembled, transported, and re-erected at a new site in Sydenham Hill in South London. A structure of 92,000 square feet was taken apart and rebuilt in a different location. The official narrative treats this as evidence of Victorian engineering ingenuity. What it actually demonstrates is that the Crystal Palace was designed to be moved, not constructed, not built from raw materials, but transported and reassembled. The modular iron and glass components were prefabricated to a tolerance that allowed exact reconfiguration. This is not how you build an exhibition space. This is how you deploy infrastructure that already exists. The Crystal Palace burned in The fire was attributed to an electrical fault. By that point, it had served its purpose. The public had marvelled at it for 80 years. Its origin had been absorbed into the narrative of Victorian progress, and its destruction removed the physical evidence that might have invited closer examination. The photographs remain. The proportions remain visible in those photographs. The scale remains impossible. Then came Paris, 1855. Then London again, 1862. Then Paris again, 1867. Then Vienna, 1873. Then Philadelphia, 1876. Then Paris, 1878. Then Barcelona, 1888. Then Paris, 1889, when they erected the Eiffel Tower. Then Chicago, 1893. Then St. Louis, 1904. Then Portland, 1905. Then Seattle, 1909. Read that list again slowly. In 64 years, 13 countries produced exhibition complexes of staggering architectural scale at a pace that, taken cumulatively, represents an output of monumental construction that no civilization in recorded history has matched before or since. Every fair produced buildings of a scale and ornamental complexity that should have required decades. Every fair was fully operational within a construction window measured in months. The official explanation for the demolitions has always centered on economics. Permanent maintenance was expensive. The land had other uses. The buildings were temporary by design. But temporary buildings are not built with 50-foot stone columns, hand-carved facades, copper domes and internal railway systems. Temporary buildings are not designed at a scale that required 27 million visitors to navigate their interiors over 6 months without congestion. Temporary buildings are not documented in photograph after photograph with the same architectural vocabulary, the same proportional language, the same stylistic signatures, regardless of which country hosted the fair or which generation of architects supposedly designed it. The buildings at the 1893 Chicago Fair look like the buildings at the 1889 Paris Fair. The buildings at the 1889 Paris Fair look like the buildings at the 1878 Paris Fair. And all of them, every single one, look like the buildings that were being photographed throughout the 19th century in cities across North America, Western Europe and Russia. The buildings that mainstream architecture history attributes to the neoclassical revival, the Beaux-Arts movement, the Victorian aesthetic sensibility. What if they all share the same architectural vocabulary? Because they are all the same architecture. What if the world's fairs were not exhibitions of industrial achievement, but exhibitions of something that already existed, cities or fragments of cities that had been built by a civilization whose identity the 19th century institutional order had every reason to obscure? I want to be precise about what I'm claiming, because the imprecise version of this theory is easy to dismiss, and the precise version is harder to ignore. I am not claiming that the world's fairs were located on top of intact Tartarian cities, fully preserved underground, simply uncovered and presented as new construction. The evidence doesn't support that specific version of the theory, and the people who advance it most aggressively tend to undermine the more defensible argument with claims that exceed the actual evidence. What I am claiming is more specific, and I think more disturbing. I am claiming that the buildings presented at the world's fairs were not constructed for the fairs. I am claiming they were discovered partially intact, partially buried under the debris of whatever catastrophic event reset the 19th century's relationship with its own architectural inheritance, cleaned, restored, repurposed, and then demolished after serving their exhibition function. Demolished specifically because their continued existence would raise questions that the emerging industrial order could not afford to answer. The mud flood theory, dismissed by mainstream scholars as conspiracy folklore, provides the necessary geological context. The theory proposes that a significant portion of the world's urban infrastructure was buried under layers of sediment sometime in the mid-19th century, leaving upper floors of existing buildings exposed while ground floors and subterranean levels were submerged. The photographic evidence for this is extensive and globally consistent. Buildings across North America, Europe and Asia from the 1850s through 1880s show ground floors partially below street level, basement windows at or below grade, and architectural proportions that only make sense if the visible building represents the upper two-thirds of a taller original structure. This is not speculation, it is visible in the photographs. Stand outside any major 19th century civic building in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, or St. Louis, and look at the ground floor windows. They sit lower than any functional design logic would explain. The streets around these buildings were built up, in some cases demonstrably so, with construction records showing the grading and filling of city blocks. But the buildings themselves predate the street level adjustment. The buildings were already there when the streets were raised around them. If this is true, if significant portions of the 19th century urban environment represented the excavated remains of a buried prior civilization, then the world's fairs acquire a completely different meaning. Consider the timeline of the 1893 Chicago Fair. The site, 690 acres of lakefront property, was officially a swamp and sand dune landscape when selected in 18. Within 3 years, it contained 200 buildings, 14 million square feet of floor space, and an architectural complex that the New York Times described as the most beautiful assemblage of buildings in human history. The chief architect, Daniel Burnham, was celebrated as a genius of organizational coordination. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the landscape plan. Hundreds of architects contributed designs. But examine the photographs of the fair's construction process. The images show buildings at advanced stages of completion, appearing in sequences that don't correspond to the official construction timeline. Structures that should represent months of work appear in photographic sequences separated by weeks. The standard explanation is that the photographs are misdated or that construction proceeded faster than the records indicate. But there is another explanation. The structures were not being built in those photographs. They were being cleaned. The scaffolding visible in construction photographs is restoration scaffolding, not erection scaffolding. The workers visible are not builders, they are finishers, applying plaster, cleaning stonework, installing fixtures in spaces that already existed. Look at the photographs of the fair's demolition. Buildings that took allegedly 6 months to erect were destroyed in weeks. The speed of the destruction consistently exceeds the speed of the reported construction. This is structurally backwards. Demolition is typically faster than construction, but not by the margins documented in the World's Fair demolition records. The only scenario in which demolition significantly outpaces construction is if the construction timeline was false, if what took months to build actually took decades, and what was destroyed in weeks was being destroyed because its permanent existence had become inconvenient. The 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle produced the Eiffel Tower, which survived, and the Palais des Machines, which did not. The Palais des Machines was, by structural engineering standards, more remarkable than the Eiffel Tower. A clear-span iron structure of 375 feet, covering a single uninterrupted interior space. Its clear span exceeded anything previously achieved in iron construction by a factor that engineers of the period could not fully explain. The official record credits Contamin and Deuter as its architects and engineers. Contemporary engineering analysis suggests the structural calculations required for the Palais des Machines exceeded the computational methods available in the 1880s. The building should not have been possible. It was demolished in Nashville, 1897. The Tennessee Centennial Exposition produced a full-scale replica of the Parthenon, not an approximation or an interpretation, but a dimensionally accurate recreation of a building that had not existed in its original form for 2,000 years. The official story is that a team of architects and engineers studied historical measurements and constructed a replica from scratch. The Nashville Parthenon still stands today, rebuilt in concrete in the 1920s after the original plaster structure deteriorated. Stand inside it. The proportions are not those of a building designed in the 1890s. They are not those of a building designed in any century, recognizable to modern architectural practice. They belong to an architectural tradition that produces spaces which function differently from modern interiors, acoustically, spatially, atmospherically. The Nashville Parthenon doesn't feel like a replica. It feels like a building with a history that its documentation doesn't account for. The architectural vocabulary of the world's fairs, the domes, the colonnades, the arched facades, the ornamental stonework, the proportional systems, is precisely the vocabulary attributed to Tartarian architecture by researchers who have mapped its distribution across the former Tartarian territories. This is not a coincidence of stylistic influence. The argument that the Beaux-Arts movement produced this vocabulary through academic training in Paris is undermined by the speed at which the vocabulary was deployed globally, by architects working across dozens of countries without consistent formal education, producing buildings that share not just stylistic features, but exact proportional relationships. You do not independently arrive at the same proportional systems unless you are working from the same source material. And the source material, the argument goes, was not a curriculum. It was the buildings themselves. The demolitions deserve sustained attention because they represent the most deliberate element of the pattern. Some World's Fair structures were permitted to survive. The Eiffel Tower in Paris, the Palace of Fine Arts in Chicago, now the Museum of Science and Industry, the Natural History Museum, produced for the 1876 Philadelphia Fair, the Singer Building, which preceded the 1904 St. Louis Fair and was demolished significantly in 1968, long after the fair itself. The structures that survived share a characteristic. They were integrated into the permanent urban fabric in ways that made demolition politically or logistically complicated. The structures that were demolished share a different characteristic. They were the most architecturally extraordinary, the most proportionally unusual, the most difficult to explain within the official construction narrative. The White City burned in 1894, 1 year after the fair closed. The official report attributed the fire to vagrants sheltering in the abandoned buildings. The fire destroyed the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, the largest building in the world at the time of its construction, along with the Administration Building, the Machinery Hall, and most of the Court of Honor. The structures that burned were precisely those that would have required the most explanation if subjected to serious architectural and historical analysis. The structures that survived were those already repurposed as museums, already absorbed into the civic identity of the city in ways that made their continued existence politically preferable to the questions their demolition would raise. The 1901 Buffalo Pan American Exposition was notable for two things: the assassination of President McKinley within its grounds and the demolition of its electric tower, a 391-foot illuminated structure that produced, according to contemporary accounts, an output of light visible for miles and powered by Niagara Falls through a transmission system that the official engineering record does not fully explain. The electric tower was demolished immediately after the fair. Photographs of it exist in quantity. Engineering analyses of those photographs suggest the structure's power output is inconsistent with the transmission technology officially available in 19. The gap between documented capability and demonstrated output is precisely the kind of gap that the free energy research literature associates with suppressed Tartarian technology. I want to address the skeptical objection directly, because it deserves honest engagement. The skeptical argument is that the world's fairs were real construction projects, achieved through the organizational genius of industrial capitalism, thousands of workers, coordinated supply chains, prefabricated components, and the motivational pressure of international prestige. The skeptical argument points to the construction records, the payroll documents, the architect's correspondence, the contractor invoices. The paper trail is real. Nobody disputes its existence. But paper trails document what was reported, not what occurred. In the context of a coordinated institutional project, paper trails can be constructed after the fact, as readily as they can be generated in real time. The question is not whether documentation exists, it does, but whether the documentation is consistent with the physical evidence. And the physical evidence, examined without the interpretive frame of the official narrative, consistently exceeds what the documentation claims was possible. This is the epistemological core of the argument. The buildings are the primary evidence. The documentation is the secondary evidence. When primary and secondary evidence conflict, you do not resolve the conflict by dismissing the primary evidence in favor of the secondary. You examine why they conflict. The world's fairs resolve the conflict through demolition. By the time serious questions about construction timelines could be asked, the structures that would have provided the most direct evidence had been burned, torn down, or buried under subsequent urban development. What remained were photographs, which could be misdated, mislabeled, or simply ignored, and the institutional inertia of the official narrative, which had been reinforced through 70 years of school curricula, museum exhibitions, and architectural history texts by the time the alternative interpretation began to gain traction in online research communities. The buildings that survived are the best evidence we have. Stand outside the Palace of Fine Arts in Chicago and measure the doorways. Stand inside the Nashville Parthenon and listen to the acoustics. Walk through the Natural History Museum in London, built for the 1851 Great Exhibition's successor institutions, and look at the ceiling height, the column spacing, the window placement. These are not buildings designed for a human population of average 19th century stature. They are not buildings designed to the proportional systems of any recognized architectural tradition. They are buildings designed to function for occupants of a scale, and within a technological system that the official history of the 19th century does not acknowledge. The world's fairs were the 19th century's mechanism for processing its own architectural inheritance. The catastrophic event that buried significant portions of the prior civilization's infrastructure, whatever that event was, however it occurred, left behind building stock of extraordinary quality that the emerging industrial order neither built nor fully understood. The fairs provided a framework for deploying that stock publicly, presenting it as new construction, celebrating it as evidence of modern achievement, extracting its organizational and commercial utility, and then destroying it before the questions it raised could be coherently formulated. 64 years, 13 countries, dozens of fairs, hundreds of buildings. The same architectural vocabulary, the same proportional systems, the same structural scale, the same pattern of extraordinary construction, followed by deliberate destruction. The last major World's Fair in this sequence, the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, 1915, produced a complex of buildings whose photographs are among the most extraordinary in the fair record. The Tower of Jewels, covered in 102,000 cut-glass nova gems that caught the light and scattered it across the surrounding buildings, stood 435 feet tall. The Palace of Fine Arts, designed by Bernard Maybeck, survives today as the most architecturally haunting structure on the West Coast, a rotunda and colonnaded hall that Maybeck himself described in a moment of unusual candor as evoking the feeling of ruins rather than new construction. He intended it, he said, to look like something being reclaimed by nature, something that had existed before and was now passing again. Maybeck may not have understood why he felt that way about his own building, Or perhaps he understood perfectly and was telling us in the only language available to him exactly what the building was. The Tower of Jewels was demolished in The Palace of Fine Arts was allowed to stand, fell into disrepair, was rebuilt in concrete in the 1960s, and remains today, the last survivor of the last major fair in the sequence, preserved precisely because its atmosphere of melancholy ruin made its permanent existence feel appropriate, rather than incongruous. It was designed to look like something ancient that had survived. Because it was. The fairs are over. The buildings are gone. The official narrative has had a century to calcify into received wisdom, taught in schools, reinforced in museums, repeated in the architecture history texts that train the professionals who maintain the buildings that still stand and explain away their proportions with the vocabulary of aesthetic choice. But the buildings are still standing. The doorways are still 15 feet tall. The ceilings still reach 30. The acoustic properties of the surviving interiors still exceed what their documented construction methods should produce. The photographs of the demolished structures still circulate, still invite the measurements and the questions that demolition was designed to foreclose. Someone decided that the World's Fairs would be temporary, that the buildings would not outlast their exhibitions, that the most extraordinary architectural achievements of the 19th century would be burned, dismantled, or buried within years of their public debut. The decision was consistent. The timing was precise. The pattern is undeniable. You do not repeatedly demolish buildings of that scale and quality for economic reasons. You demolish them because their continued existence is a problem, because they raise questions, because the people who built the world that replaced them understood, with a clarity we are only now beginning to recover, that some evidence is too large to hide and must therefore be destroyed. I keep coming back to a single photograph from the 1893 Chicago Fair. It shows the Court of Honor at night, the buildings illuminated by electric light, the central basin reflecting the glow back upward against the dark sky. The scale is extraordinary, not just the buildings but the space between them, the coordinated illumination, the management of a nocturnal urban environment at a sophistication that no city in 1893 had yet achieved for its permanent infrastructure. Chicago in 1893 did not have this. Not in its streets, not in its neighborhoods, not in its permanent civic buildings, but for 6 months, on a site that was officially a swamp 3 years earlier, it existed, fully realized, fully functional, fully documented in thousands of photographs that show a city of impossible beauty operating at a level of technological and architectural integration that the rest of the world would not reach for another 50 years. And then they burned it down.